Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Patrick Keegan, who is a professor in the School of Education and Counseling at Purdue University Northwest. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me today.
I know you've written a lot about social emotional learning and about social studies teacher education, and you did an interesting bit of research in New York with some high school students. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I conducted a study with some high school students in New York City that were attending a school that was specifically for late arrival immigrant youth. So all these students were recent immigrants to New York City, and the study was on their conceptions of citizenship. So I used kind of a unique approach, which was to give them cameras, and I asked them to photograph places where they felt a sense of belonging, both in their school, in their communities, in their homes. And then I used those photographs to learn more about how they're thinking of citizenship and what it means to be, a member of their community.
And I understand you didn't just look at the photos, you actually then interviewed them and put them in focus groups and used the focus as the pictures as kind of a catalyst to get them to talk about their experiences.
Exactly, yeah. So there were a couple different stages. First, I met just with them one-on-one so they could tell me more about why they took particular photos, what they wanted to highlight in the photo, and then formed focus groups with other students in the project. And then they were able to comment on one another's pictures and kind of build more of a collective story of themselves.
Well, that's interesting to people outside of education, I'm sure, even because of the commentary that we've heard about immigrants are coming here to cause trouble, and they're taking advantage of the system and things like that. So what was your perspective of that based on the work you did?
Yeah, so they took these photographs, and I conducted this study in 2016. So at that time, it was during the presidential election, and Donald Trump was running for president and making some pretty disparaging remarks about immigrants, like you just alluded to.
Yeah.
At that time, he was proposing a wall on the Mexico-U.S. border. He wanted to put a ban on people coming from certain Muslim-majority countries, and some of these students were from Muslim-majority countries, and so their photographs really were, I think, a way to speak back to some of those negative portrayals of immigrants as, not deserving belonging or dangerous or threatening to the United States in some way.
And so what's a profile of a typical immigrant student based on your research?
Well, there were only about 12 students in my study, and yet I think everyone was really unique and different. So I think it'd be hard to, say here's one particular profile, but some of the students were U.S. citizens. They were born in the United States, but had actually gone back to their home country or other countries to be raised for a while, and then returned to the United States as high school students. Others were coming to the U.S. to join maybe their mom or father, who had already established residency here. They came from many different countries. So it really varied a lot in terms of what brought them here.
Well, what did you see in the photographs? What did they come back with?
Right. So one of the themes really in the photographs was the importance of the caring relationships that they developed in school with their teachers and with other students. So as I mentioned, this school was specifically for late arrival immigrant students. So there were kids who, spoke a variety of different languages. Probably the majority spoke Spanish as their first language. They came from different Latin American countries, but also, from countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. So they developed caring relationships with one another that really spoke back to this idea that they, didn't deserve to be here or didn't.
Sure. So what was the evidence of these caring relationships? What exactly were you finding?
Well, some of their photographs were documenting this. So they included things like a photograph with a teacher who one student spoke about really, cared for them in a deep way. Were almost more than just a teacher and like a friend. They also specifically choreographed pictures with other students in their school to show, the variety of different backgrounds that students had and how they developed, a sense of community, and how they also made each other feel welcome. For example, some of the students who spoke Spanish as their first language would sometimes use English to include other students in the school who maybe spoke Arabic, but could speak in English. So sometimes English was kind of the language that they could all communicate in together. So they talked about that in their photographs.
It sounds like one of the old Star Trek episodes where everybody comes from a different background and they're all trying to relate to one another. I think there was a reference in there to a kid who stood up on a desk or something to take a picture, and you saw a lot of meaning in that. Can we talk about that?
Sure. So yeah, one student did. He kind of took a bird's eye view of the classroom, and I asked him how he took that picture, and he explained he had to get up on the chair to get that particular angle. And when I asked him why, he said, well, because I really wanted to emphasize the variety of backgrounds of the students in my class and how we're all kind of mingling and getting along together. So things like that, were ways that they used the camera to really tell a certain story. Another student took a picture of a group of students that looked much like a family portrait. There was a boy in the picture, and he was standing behind some other women in the picture, and they were seated, and it looked like a family. And that's really how they thought of their school. Was it kind of fostered that kind of a closeness amongst the students. And so she kind of wanted to, I think, create that feeling in the picture when you looked at it.
Those are great insights. I appreciate hearing that. So you have the responsibility of preparing college students who are going to be teachers to deal with issues when they get into the classroom. How does this? How do you take this research and use that when you're talking to your education students here at the university?
Right. Well, one way I could apply this, or I use this to prepare pre-service teachers, is thinking about when they teach civics, for example, right? There's a traditional approach to civics that emphasizes, how it's important to know how government works, about how a bill becomes a law.
How many senators per state, things like that, things you have to memorize, right?
Sure, exactly. But these students, I think, challenge some of those traditional conceptions of like what it means to be a good citizen. A lot of them also maintain ties to not just the United States, but the countries that maybe they immigrated from. They had a lot of depth of perspective about how democracies run, and they didn't always have those perspectives welcomed into the classroom. Or that's not necessarily how we typically teach students to be good citizens, right? We don't think about that kind of transnational perspective. So I talked to my pre-service teachers about why it's important to not just prepare them as citizens of this country, but why it can be really important to welcome that diversity of perspectives, into the classroom. As assets, right?
Yeah. What's different about growing up in that and being in a classroom like that as opposed to being into a traditional classroom like most of us remember when we were kids?
Well, you're going to have, students who maybe speak a variety of different languages, right? Not just English. So thinking about how they can learn maybe certain concepts, government concepts, right? Both in English, but also perhaps in their home language, and be able to.
I know you're teaching about social studies,
right.
And I know when I was a kid and I was in a class like that, I was seeing pictures in a book, but part of your social study lesson is sitting all around you in the classroom, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So how can we tap into the resources that those children are bringing into the classroom?
What are some ways that they do that?
Well, some may have come to this country because they were seeking, better educational opportunities, or maybe greater freedoms that they didn't necessarily have in their home countries.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty interesting perspective, I think, that they bring to democracy in the United States, and how, coming from a country maybe where their leader was, authoritarian figure, right? What do they understand about authoritarianism that might apply to the United States, or that they could, compare different systems of government, not just what we have here in the U.S., but other countries, and what's better and worse or just different about those different types of government.
And these are high school students that you were dealing with in your research, right?
Yes, they were.
So they certainly may have had political opinions and their own thoughts about this.
Definitely.
So do they get into debates sometimes? Does it create any animosity, the diversity?
No, I think that was very much what they wanted to counter, right? We are either like a family or like a community, and
right.
we also there's joy in learning about other points of view and other perspectives that are different from how maybe you were raised or how you grew up. So they really, I think, welcomed that opportunity. It wasn't like a source of tension or conflict in the classroom.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a good experience for the immigrant students and also for the American students that were born here, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. As you're preparing people to teach in high schools, what other issues do you have to prepare them to deal with? Language issues, things like that? What do you talk about?
Well, today there's a lot of, I think, other topics that are considered maybe sensitive or perhaps controversial. So, when preparing my pre-service teachers, and now I also work with those who want to become elementary school teachers, not just high school teachers. So they're even maybe more reticent to talk about certain topics they might think are not developmentally appropriate to discuss with maybe third graders, right, around, say, immigration. But some of their students might also be immigrants, or they're aware of, some of the, topics that are being discussed, or the ways immigrants are being talked about in society or in the community. So how can they navigate some of those kind of sensitive topics in their classroom?
Well, let's pick one and tell me how you would suggest they navigate.
Well, I always tell students, if you're worried about whether or not a topic is developmentally appropriate, follow the student. So if a student comes into your classroom and says, I heard about this thing on the news, I heard that, I don't know, Donald Trump is going to deport, immigrants,
Right.
then it means that they are already aware of this topic, right? As the teacher, you're not introducing some concept that they're not ready to wrestle with.
Right.
They're concerned about it, and they're coming and looking to you for guidance, or maybe more information, or maybe a chance to talk to their peers about what they've heard, or how they make sense of what they're seeing on the news or reading in the newspaper, et cetera. So I always tell my students becoming teachers, right, is follow the lead of the students. And I think if you're doing that, then you're less likely to be accused of, I don't know, introducing a topic that kids aren't ready to talk about.
Good advice, I think, in a lot of different areas, right? The other thing that I'm curious about is the approach that you're talking about here takes advantage of the diversity of the classroom here. So to what extent do you bring in and let the students bring in, or encourage your students to have their students bring in the experiences that the kids in the classroom had from their countries that they came from?
Right. I do encourage. I think that's that's very important, and it's a learning resource that you have as the educator, right? Is to build on the interests that your students bring to the classroom, the life experiences that they have, the perspectives that they bring to the topics you're teaching about.
Yeah. One last question on the research you did in New York. Sure. You gave them cameras. Mm-hmm. What kind of cameras did you give them?
It's funny, I actually debated this because at that time a lot of the students had cell phones, so they had phones that could take pictures. I did give them digital cameras, and I asked them to use those cameras just because I wanted to level the playing field and make sure they all had the same equipment to work with. Yeah. Interestingly, some of them, actually would take pictures of pictures. So they would take their phone out and they would photograph a picture they already had on their phone to kind of go beyond maybe the tool that I had given them.
That's very, very artistic of them to do that, I think. Yeah.
Or they would Google images on the internet and they would take a picture of their laptop to show maybe, a beach in the Dominican Republic where, they had a memory or they wanted to share that aspect with.
Yeah. That was a great idea for a project. I guess that's not an uncommon research tool now, right? There's a lot of work being done like that.
Well, I think
some work,
yeah. I think as a way to also level the power imbalance between the researcher and the participant, right? So by giving them the camera and letting them kind of take those pictures and then using those pictures to guide the interviews that I did with them, gave them more control over the interview process, helped them put them in the position of being an expert, right, on their own civic experiences in a way that is not always possible when you as the researcher have your list of questions and you're going through them during an interview.
Yeah. So there's a huge percentage of our student population now that's foreign born. Mm-hmm. How do you prepare your college, teaching education students to deal with the literacy issues?
Well, it's difficult, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think, in some places, maybe like Northwest Indiana, there's, of course, more and more students who come to school speaking, other languages as their first language. But it's not always a majority of the students, so it might just be a couple students in the class, right, who maybe speak Spanish as their native language. So one strategy is to maybe partner students together who are native Spanish speakers to kind of support one another, and maybe one student in the class is more proficient in English and can kind of serve as, to help welcome that newer student into the classroom. Some teachers are using, Google Translate and other kinds of technological tools to kind of help, a student who maybe speaks a different language than the teacher as well. Not all of our teachers themselves are bilingual or speak, multiple languages, so sometimes that's a challenge too.
Yeah, it's interesting how much we've evolved here. What are some other strategies you give them to use?
In general, like in terms of
Well, yeah, just something that maybe I wouldn't have experienced when I was in school that they're doing now that's more innovative here.
Well, we certainly have more technological tools at our disposal
Yeah.
now than in the past. So I mentioned, Google Translate is one example
Sure.
maybe, but I think when we're trying to expose students in the United States to other parts of the world that they can't maybe physically travel to, right, we can use Google Earth or other kinds of, the internet to learn about how life is different in other parts of the world.
So what's your own experience? Did you teach for part of your career in high school or grade school? Tell me.
Yeah, I was a teacher, a fifth grade to start, and then I moved on and taught middle school. At that point, I focused on social studies. That's kind of where my love of that discipline originated from, was really as a social studies teacher.
Yeah.
I taught in New Hampshire. We didn't have a lot of emergent bilingual students in New Hampshire. It was, but I did try to help students kind of develop a sense of place and a connection to local history. So I was working with, maybe the resources that we had or the local resources in that particular location. And then I went on to do this research in New York City, which is where I grew up, but also, is a place that's well known for a lot of, immigrants coming to that place. So those.
So how would you say the immigrant situation is different in New York than it might be from a city in Texas near the border or something?
Well, I can compare maybe, certain places like New York, which have a long history of immigration, where there's already a history of maybe immigrants from certain parts of the world coming to New York City. So as an immigrant, you might be part of joining maybe an ethnic enclave, right, in that particular part of New York City.
Yeah. And then in the schools, do you see that turning up in the schools too, that people of particular ethnic groups are sticking together? And
Sure, because to some degree the schools are based on where you live. So, schools in those neighborhoods are going to reflect the population of that neighborhood. So some schools, have a lot of students from Latin America, or maybe other schools might have a larger Asian population of students. Whereas maybe, places like Northwest Indiana, we're close to Chicago, so of course there is some history of immigration in this region as well, but it's not the concentration of immigrants maybe in a place like New York or closer to the border in Texas, for example.
so from what you're saying, it sounds like there isn't a lot of mixing of immigrants from different countries. They tend to go into particular neighborhoods, and they're mostly surrounded by people with similar backgrounds. Is that the case?
I think that's fair to say. I think it's one thing that made the school where I did my research unique, because there was a little bit of that. And like I said, I think probably most students were bilingual in Spanish and English, but there were also students from other countries. So it kind of forced the students to go outside their comfort zone, right? And learn. A Spanish speaker might be learning Arabic so that they could form a friendship with that student. And there was, I think, people letting down their guard, right, and kind of learning more about one another than maybe in some cases in places where they didn't have to do that because all the students are kind of from the same maybe close-knit community or ethnic group.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to see your take on this. So, people are characterizing these immigrant students in different ways, right? They're potential criminals or they're dreamers, right? What is your experience with them? Tell us about a couple students that you talked to and what their take on being in America was like.
Well, I think of one student who immigrated to New York City from Senegal. She came and joined her mom, who was already living here, and a half sibling as well. And she had a really interesting perspective on this idea of boundaries. I remember during one conversation she said, like, why do we have these boundaries? In some ways it was a simple question, but it was also very profound, right? We have these borders that divide the United States from Mexico, but why does that line, why does it really exist there?
And fences around our property and things like that.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
right? And she was sort of questioning that whole notion, like who got to decide where that line is drawn, and would it be better if we just eliminated these, divisions? And that, I think, really was a pretty awesome perspective.
Good for her, yeah. Another example, someone else you've talked to that had an interesting take on things?
Yeah. I mean, another student actually was born in the United States, and he was sent to Senegal also to live with his grandmother for about 10 years and then came back to the United States. So he actually had U.S. citizenship, and this is in New York, so he talked about the Museum of Natural History. If you're familiar with that museum, has
Sure.
an exhibit on many different languages, and he loved the museum because he thought it actually, brought recognition to the variety of different languages that are spoken on the continent of Africa, and why that was important for other people to realize that Africa is a diverse continent, right? And as opposed to some of the things that were said at the time about people from African countries being dangerous or bringing diseases or things like that. So
Yeah.
he actually saw that museum as a way of kind of challenging that kind of limited perspective on diversity.
So when we think of them as citizens and learning citizenship, how do they see themselves as citizens? How do they see themselves as being representatives of two nations, or do they tend to be gravitating more towards the American experience? Do some of them maybe resent that their parents brought them over here and took them away from home? What kind of reactions are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think it really varied. I didn't see too much. Most of the students, I think, had some voice and agency in whether or not they came.
Oh, really?
So because they were older and they came older, so sometimes they wanted to come to join,
Okay.
maybe their mother who was already established here in the United States, or father, or something like that. I think, but they did very much see themselves still connected to not just America, but also, Senegal, in those previous examples. And I don't think they felt like they had to choose, right? Like, why pick one? Either gravitate more towards being an American or Senegalese. Like, I think they really straddled those different places and boundaries, and they could, they saw benefits and advantages to both. So I think they really didn't see themselves as citizens of one nation, just the United States, or, just Senegal. It was really kind of both.
And isn't that true of most of the ethnic groups that have come to the United States, right? To the Germans and the Italians and the Greeks and the Jews, they're still connected to where they came from, even 2, 3 generations later, 4 generations later, right?
Right. And I think we sometimes look back to those previous generations of immigrants and we kind of say, well, they assimilated, right? They became American. They severed those ties to Germany or Ireland or wherever they immigrated from. But that wasn't always the case even back then, Well,
so we're still celebrating St. Patrick's Day and, all of those holidays and things that we brought over with us many, many years ago, right? So what got you interested in all this?
Well, partly being a New Yorker and living in New York City, I was surrounded by people of all different, backgrounds. I, come from a family affected by immigration too. You have to go back a few generations to get to when my immigrant, ancestors came to the United States. Also, I have a stepfather who's Chinese American, and I have sisters that are adopted from South Korea. So,
so you're sort of a symbol of what you're researching here, aren't you?
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah. So do you find that you really relate to this just before you even thought about it? You just felt naturally tuned into what they were going through?
I think curious, I would say, right?
Yeah.
You know, kind of wanting to learn more and definitely interested in their experiences. I don't know that I could directly relate to them, but definitely
Yeah.
I think it made me want to learn more about the world
Yeah.
from their point of view.
Yeah. That's all the time we have for our program right now. I want to thank Dr. Patrick Keegan for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.